Oh, hello. Is power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh really all that different from Magic the Gathering? What does Yu-Gi-Oh have to offer digitally that Magic the Gathering lacks or perhaps succeeds in? How valuable are old Yu-Gi-Oh cards versus Magic? And what are the cultural differences among Yu-Gi-Oh players versus Magic the Gathering players? Well, these are questions that many Magic the Gathering players might ask, and indeed many Yu-Gi-Oh players might ask of Magic. So that's what we're talking today, Yu-Gi-Oh versus Magic the Gathering. And to have that conversation, I have invited the one, the only, Paul of Team APS, one of the best Yu-Gi tubers out there. I've been a big fan of the channel for a long time, and I asked Paul to come on down here to the Magic the Gathering realm to talk all things Yu-Gi-Oh. Paul, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And for anybody who doesn't already know, because I know that a lot of my viewership are either former Yu-Gi-Oh players or maybe still play a little bit on the side or have friends who still do, Team APS is such an awesome channel for Yu-Gi-Oh content. They do a little bit of everything. They remind me a lot of myself. That's how I first found them, was that they're talking storage solutions and products and what works best and things like that, but also comedy skits and decks and power talk and just a lot of fun. Pretty much all things that you want. If you're looking for Yu-Gi-Oh content, I will link them below. Cannot recommend them enough. It's actually a team of 7 friends talking Yu-Gi-Oh, but Paul, kind of the captain, I suppose, is come here today to talk about the cultural differences.
Yeah, I honestly, you covered it there. I remember basically I'd made a tweet about, like, I was trying to figure out, do Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, other card games like that, have similar issues with power creep and some other kind of related things that come from that? And I remember that, like, you retweeted it, and I got a lot of input from that, and so that seemed like that's basically kind of how this video came about.
Yeah. Well, I'd had in the back of my mind, I was telling you before we started recording that I first found you because you were talking products, and I love products, and I was curious what your take on, I think the very first video of yours I saw was you were talking BCW, and then later you talked Ultimate Guard, and you've pretty much covered it all as well, but for the Yu-Gi-Oh sized cards and sleeves. And then I saw, oh, funny skits. And you just did a skit last week. It'll be one of the videos I link below, where you were making jokes about, you know, what you encounter as a Yu-Gi-Oh player culturally at a tournament or at the local game store. And even though I don't know the first thing about Yu-Gi-Oh, I followed along with 99% of it. And I thought, wow, this might as well be about Magic the Gathering. And then when you made your tweet about power levels, I thought, all right, I got to reach out. We got to do a video talking about these differences to see where we sync up and where we differ.
Yeah, for sure. It's like it's two games that, like, I feel like everybody thinks are, you know, night and day different, but also I feel like there's got to be some common ground. So.
All right, well, why don't we start with power creep? Because my impression of Yu-Gi-Oh, as someone I never played Yu-Gi-Oh when I was younger. I started with Magic. I have lots of friends who play it. And of course, as someone who at points in his life has practically lived at his local game store where Yu-Gi-Oh tournaments are held alongside Magic ones, you know, have chatted with and met plenty of Yu-Gi-Oh players. My impression has always been, first and foremost, that Yu-Gi-Oh is the power creep game, that Yu-Gi-Oh is all about power creep, that each new set has to top the last, that the older cards, and I want to ask you about formats in a minute because I don't know about that, but my impression is that those older cards are 99% of the time going to just not be able to keep up with whatever new thing Konami is coming out with. Is that an accurate perception, or what's it like over in Yu-Gi-Oh?
I will say that what you've heard is pretty accurate, honestly. Yu-Gi-Oh, it's definitely the power creep game. It's an interesting thing for Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, I think, because so I expect power creep in virtually anything, you know, any card game, any, you know, competitive video games, those types of things. Everything kind of has it. I think with Yu-Gi-Oh though, it feels much more pronounced, and, you know, everybody kind of has their reason why they think it is. My personal take is that I think Yu-Gi-Oh as a game didn't have a lot of restrictions in place early on. So, you know, unlike many card games, there's not really much of a resource system If you see a card, you can oftentimes just activate the card immediately. And if you see another card, then you can activate the next card you see. And, you know, like, I know a lot of card games, even ones that I'm not super familiar with, will have, like, card effects that allow players to, let's say, draw 2 cards.
Right.
But in Yu-Gi-Oh, that card, the card that does that, is banned and has been banned for years and years, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, just the idea of simply a card that gets you even just a small +1 in card economy leads to another card that you can play immediately, which can lead to another card that you play immediately. And it just ends up becoming this thing where, like, cards oftentimes search other cards straight from the deck, or summon other monsters straight from the deck. And those monsters can then immediately kind of do the thing that they do, and there's never really much of a limit. And so what we've seen in recent years is that alongside new summoning mechanics that have kind of been introduced over the past several years that usually involve what's called an extra deck. So this is this sort of pool of monsters that are separate from your deck, and you're able to summon them by, like, let's say, sending 2 monsters from your field to the graveyard, and you summon this new type of monster from your extra deck. There's no limit to how many times you can do that. And oftentimes the requirements to summon said monsters are rather generic requirements. It might just be like, oh, 2 monsters that have the same type, or 2 monsters that have different names, or, you know, something that's very easy to fulfill. And so what kind of ends up happening is just decks can ladder through and, like, make 1 monster, use its effect, get something from their deck, make another monster, use its effect, get something from their deck, and just keep climbing, and then you can end with these very powerful monsters. And of course, for Konami, in order to counter that, they've used it for a combination of, you know, shifting formats and ban lists, but also just making stronger cards, because the only way to make the past thing, I guess, not as desirable, it's already sold enough, you got to make the next thing a little stronger, a little faster.
Sure.
And that's kind of where we ended up today.
Magic has I view Magic as having the opposite problem, and I'm not saying that we don't have power creep, we absolutely do in Magic, but in many ways, Magic has to look at some of its earliest cards and say we can never make cards as good as what we did at the start of the game. That every new set has a dual land, but that dual land can never ever be as good as the original dual lands from 25 years ago. That is the ceiling, and that everything has to be at least 1 notch below it. We have something called the Power 9, and these are all horribly, terribly broken cards from the first year of Magic, but they have set what the limit is, and everything gets compared to things like original counterspell. And we have counterspells in every set, but they can never ever be as good as original counterspell. We can't reprint Lightning Bolt into our standard format. It has to be slightly weaker Lightning Bolt because it's just too good. And so while we do have cards that individually are out of control power-wise, and we've been having a terrible case of far too many bans happening in the last couple years of them making cards that are just too powerful for individual formats. On the whole, our power creep is something that the design team actively doesn't want to have happen. They might power up a set, but there's this ceiling in place. We can never be more powerful than X, which is in many ways our earliest cards. And so it sounds like if I've got any viewers here that are like, oh, wow, I used to play Yu-Gi-Oh! I want to pull out I've still got my collection from 8 years back. It sounds to me like if they go and pull out that Yu-Gi-Oh! Collection from 8 years back, that all of those cards are going to seem weak in comparison, whereas in Magic, you go back 8 years in Magic, and actually some of those cards from 8 years ago, it's like, no, we could never do Liliana of the Veil or Snapcaster Mage again. That was way too much. That's the new ceiling. We create, with each new set, we create new ceilings and kind of have to keep it underneath that in future iterations. So it's like those old cards are too powerful for Standard now. We have that problem. We can't reprint cards for the formats that want to play them because they'd be just too powerful in Standard.
That's so interesting to me. Yu-Gi-Oh! is very similar in a way. So there are a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh's earliest cards, and this requires a bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! History, but I can sort of make it simple. So in Yu-Gi-Oh's like earliest iterations, there were some extremely powerful cards, most of them being like spell cards or trap cards, but several monsters as well. And that's where you have these things like Pot of Greed or Graceful Charity that are just like kind of a mass draw, like draw 2 or draw 3 cards, then discard 2. And you've also got some very powerful spells that just do things like discard 2 cards from your opponent's hand, or just pick 5 cards from your deck and your opponent picks one, you get it, and the rest go to the grave. So like very obnoxious cards. And those have all long since been banned. Konami will never, it's highly unlikely that would ever be like, released from a ban list. But in recent years, this really kind of feels like it's something that's been over the past decade. The game's bans have actually shifted from cards that are just overpowering in a vacuum to cards that are overpowering in tandem with other cards. And that's sort of the result of Yu-Gi-Oh! Going from a game about building your deck around maybe like 40 good cards that have individually good effects versus now where like we kind of have archetypes. So like you'll just have a theme, like, okay, these monsters called Madolce. They're all based on like sweet foods and pastries and stuff, and it's cute. But their monsters all search each other, or their monsters all revive each other, or like if you have one on the field, then you can summon another, and you need 2 of them to make their boss monster. And so because the game has shifted from sort of just generic good cards to themes that work really closely together, it means that oftentimes Konami can make an archetype itself extremely powerful and even maybe emulate some of those older banned cards' effects, or even do things that are potentially scarier, like a monster that maybe just doesn't allow your opponent to play or do a certain thing. And so now the cards that tend to get banned aren't actually a generic thing that any deck could use, but rather it's a certain strategy was just too consistent, like a certain archetype was just too consistent, so that archetype had to get its search spell limited, or its monster that summons a bunch of things from the deck, like, had to get limited.
Right.
And that's been a really interesting thing because it's like early on it felt kind of more like what you're describing in Magic, but then now I think it's very different. And it goes on and on. There's certainly like more to the story than that, but I think that's actually an interesting sort of thing. It feels like Yu-Gi-Oh! Did start in that same place and now has just shifted somewhat.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but English Yu-Gi-Oh cards do not do the same thing as the Japanese ones. That's something I've heard, that the Japanese set comes out and it's designed in Japan, and then there's an English team that both translates but also might make adjustments if there was a problematic card. So like it might do less or do more. Is that true or is that not true?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
So the cards do they for the most part are sort of created in Japan, and then the cards are created and designed in Japan by whatever team it is there. That's where they're conceptualized, and they will come over to the United States, a few months later or perhaps several months later, and it's an interesting dynamic there because they don't change the cards' effects, but what can sometimes change is the formats that the games are played in. Most people know Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a ban list, and like there's cards that are banned, limited, and semi-limited. But because the Japanese game gets sets earlier, and sometimes they'll get cards earlier that we might not ever get for like months or even years, they effectively are playing a different game because the card pool is different. And in Japan, a certain strategy or deck might be really dominant. Here in the United States, it's not as dominant, or maybe here in the United States, it's not out yet. And so for a long time, up until I want to say maybe around 2008, the two games shared the same ban list, which it kept things pretty simple, but there were like a few small issues, but for the most part, it was fine. Since then, though, they've actually diverted the formats. So in Japan, there's a completely different set of banned cards, limited cards, semi-limited cards. It looks similar overall, but those, the devil's in the details, right? Like, sometimes we can end up with a card that doesn't do very well over here in the United States or just in the West because a certain other strategy has already been like limited here, but it wasn't as harshly limited over there. And so the cards do the same thing, but in effect you can have a very different looking game just because of what strategies are or aren't available. And as for cards that get effect tweaks, Yu-Gi-Oh! Does have erratas, but they're pretty few and far in between. In recent years, Konami's kind of been making a bit of an effort to take some older banned cards and errata them, although the player base has like mixed opinions on that. Some people feel like, well, leave the card as it was, even if it has to stay banned. I want it to kind of stay exactly what it was. Like, you're kind of killing the spirit of the card. Other people feel like, well, it's cool if it means adding some type of a small restriction to the card, but it means that you can now bring it off the ban list and people can play it again. That some people are happy about that, but that's an unrelated thing. But yeah, the games do have the same card effects and everything. It's just that slightly different card pool and that slightly different format that can create a lot of sort of dissonance there.
Yeah, we tend to never do an errata to cards, and it's something that gets brought up a lot, where we might have a card that needs to be banned and people will be saying, boy, if you just change the +1 ability on Oko to a -1 ability or something like that, that it will make the card playable, and maybe we should just do that. But the belief has always been what's printed on the card is how the card is played, and there's no erratas. There were some at a very, very old point in terms of templating issues, but then we just had a major errata for the first time, where there was this entire card called Companions that was so broken and so disruptive to every format that there were, that they would have had to ban so many cards from throughout the entire game, that they just issued a kind of watering down or nerfing errata to them that seems to have worked. But that was a big controversy and such that we just went through with Companions.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. I mean, I know in Yu-Gi-Oh! The sentiment's generally very similar. It seems like just in recent years, I think Konami has taken a concerted effort to try to clear up the ban list. I know when we get into like kind of how formats work in Magic, because I actually have some questions about that.
Yeah.
In Yu-Gi-Oh, I mean, the game just goes. I think that's actually sort of tied to the power creep problem. Our ban list effectively will just get longer and longer and longer with time.
Right.
Like, cards can come off, and they do come off, as years pass and power creep. Okay, this card used to be pretty oppressive, now it's virtually useless. Maybe that's a problem in and of itself, but anywho, the thing is with Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just like, we have this long ban list, and just sometimes it can almost feel overwhelming when you consider, just the idea that like there's like 60 or more cards on this ban list, and if a new player gets into the game, they have to go through and like, do I have this? Do I have this? Do I have this? It's just, it can feel very overwhelming. I think Konami does try to release cards, and when they can't release cards, I guess they sometimes want to resort to errating cards, and people. I do see why that's a contentious issue, but I don't think it's. I don't know if it's necessarily a good or a bad thing. I guess it really just depends on who you ask.
Right.
And also, how heavy-handed are they with it? Because sometimes, like, it'll be a small tweak to a card that keeps the spirit of what it's supposed to do, and it's fine. And other times, they'll almost completely rework it, and it feels like you're sort of destroying some of the history that's there in the card itself by just completely reworking the thing and then still calling it that same name.
Yeah. So you said you're curious. You had a question about Magic the Gathering formats. That I had a question for you, but you go first about Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats,
Yeah, okay.
but you first.
Yeah, so with Magic the Gathering, I know that there's a few different formats I've heard of, but can you explain what is the most commonly played format, and how does the phrase rotation apply? Because I hear it said a lot, and I have a gist of kind of what it means. Like, to my understanding, it sounds like every couple of years, the current card pool is basically replaced with like sort of a new card pool. I don't know how much of that like carries over. How does that work?
Well, what you're describing is our standard format, and it was up until recently the kind of premier or flagship format of Magic the Gathering. It's possibly changed. It's hard to get full information on numbers, but standard has always been, well, not always, but for the longest period of time, for decades, literally, standard has been the premier constructed format, where the way it works is we have 4 sets come out per year. So we have a fall set, a winter set, a spring set, and then in the summer we have what we call a core set come out. And standard is made up of the last 2 years worth of Magic the Gathering sets. So anything that is from sets older than 2 years isn't in standard. But in order to make sense of that, because every day that would kind of be changing, or at least every couple of months, we have a rotation day. And so up until that, so up until that rotation day, we don't take things out of the format. And so basically we go and a new set, we've got the last 2 years worth of sets, and then a new set comes out and we add that. And then a new set comes out in the winter and we add that. And then a new set comes out in the summer and we add that. And then in the fall, with the fall set, that's when rotation happens. And then we look at what sets are in standard, and the ones that on rotation day are more than 2 years old rotate out. And then the ones that came out, so basically the ones that came out 2 years ago drop out of standard, and the ones from last year remain in, and then we build on to that over the course of the next year. The fall set gets added, the winter set gets added, the spring set gets added, the summer set gets added, and then we get to fall in its rotation day, and what was once 1 year old is now 2 years old, and those sets fall out of standard, as it were. And so that's the standard format and what rotation is. But then my question for you about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is what we have in Magic is we can then go back, and we have several formats, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, Vintage, and each one is essentially defined by simply having a larger card pool. So Modern, for example, instead of just the last 2 years, Modern never rotates, and it goes all the way back 10 plus years old, and it's every card from this one particular edition forward. And so if you have old cards in your collection, they're all, unless they've been individually banned, they're all good. Any Yu-Gi-Oh players who used to play Magic in high school that have an 8-year-old, trade folder still on their shelf, they could pull that out, and in the Modern format, they could still play with those cards, assuming that they make a good deck or whatever. Legacy, even further back. Legacy would go back to when I was in high school, sort of thing. Vintage is the format where all the broken banned cards that are outrageous and banned everywhere from the early days of Magic. Vintage is where those are okay, where you can have one of them in your deck, so that you can play even with those horrible broken cards of old. And so that's the way our formats are largely set up.
So question.
Yes.
I've heard about this kind of roughly on Twitter. Magic the Gathering does not, and I think this is probably partly a result of just standards rotating in and out, but Magic the Gathering does not get loads of card reprints, it sounds like, to my understanding.
Yeah. Well, we do get reprints, but they're done in a controlled way. So they will reprint a card, but we'll reprint it in a special set that is very limited in availability. And what'll happen is that you're not really decreasing the price of the card, because so an average Magic the Gathering booster pack is $4. So they've got all these cards that are worth $40, $50, $80, $100 each, and they're these in-demand cards because they're that expensive for a reason. But they won't print those in the $4 packs. They'll print those in packs that they don't print that many of, and then because there's not that many of the packs will be $15 a pack, $20 a pack, and because the packs are $15 a pack or $20 a pack, it means that those $40, $50, $60, $80, $100 cards don't really decrease in price too much. It'll maybe go down a little. And there are definitely cases where some cards are what we call artificially expensive, where it's a case of a card that really doesn't need to be $200, and it's just because it was from this really weird old rare set and there weren't a lot of copies of it. And then they reprint that one and it goes from $200 to $20, and nobody cares because that was artificial. But for the quote unquote real Magic cards that are $100 each, they'll reprint them, but not in a way that makes them $10 each. And it's demonstrable that they don't want to.
So it's by design.
Yeah, by design to protect that value.
That's interesting to me. Yu-Gi-Oh is very much different in that regard.
I've heard that you guys reprint it into the ground. I've heard that Yu-Gi-Oh will reprint cards into the ground.
So, but it's funny you say that. I think that depending on who you ask, they're not reprinting enough. But I think that, comparatively, Yu-Gi-Oh! Does a lot more reprints. I think this gets into somewhat contentious territory, but what doesn't? So, with Yu-Gi-Oh! A card could come out and like let's take the Lightning Storm example I gave earlier. This card, you got to have 3 of it if you're planning on like really competing. You need to have 3 copies. It's $120 roughly on the secondary market. Pretty tough card to pull. I can't like go buying packs and just expect to pull it. So the thing with the reprints in Yu-Gi-Oh, we know that this card will get reprinted. It will. That's just sort of Konami's thing. It will get reprinted, but it's just hard to know when. Much like with the ban lists, there's not like all right, well, this card came out because by the way, for reference, this card Lightning Storm released in January of this year. But it's rather unlikely that it will get reprinted this year. Like, it's possible it could happen towards the end of this year, but it's rather unlikely. There are certain reprint sets, like sets that are, like, that this set's going to come out around this time every year, and it's going to have reprints, but you still won't even know what reprints they are. And you still won't know, okay, well, will Lightning Storm be in, like, this year's reprint set? Will it be in a smaller kind of off-brand reprint set? Like, there's a lot of sort of spin-off sets that Konami likes to do, and because you just don't know, sometimes it means that a reprint might change a card's value. Sometimes it means it won't. Because you can't rely on when it will happen, that's tricky. And then also, sometimes the reprint sets are kind, and sometimes they're not. So, for instance, any Yu-Gi-Oh player will recognize Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. It's a card that came out in 2017. Very powerful staple. It became like it kind of warped the game around it, and it was about $80. You needed to have 3. This was pretty much non-negotiable, and it stayed that way for a year and a half. When it finally was reprinted in a sort of spin-off set, it was short printed in that spin-off set. So just getting the reprint copy of it was still maybe around $40-50. And then the original copy was, kind of held some value. It only decreased a tad bit. So then they reprinted it again in another set. And in that third set, it was actually, I think, still short printed. So a little bit cheaper, but still not like drastically so. And then finally, it got reprinted as just a common card in a structure deck that like is sold by the boatload at Walmart. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me because basically it sounds like in Magic, while reprints are just not like happening all over the place, and Yu-Gi-Oh reprints can happen, but they are still very unpredictable, and you can't know when they'll happen. You can't know how much they'll affect the market. Like with ban lists, you're very much playing with a game of fire and just walking on eggshells with it.
Yeah. It's been one of the big points of my channel has been advocating for more reprints because I view it as something that shuts down access to the game where new and returning players don't have the ability to get the decks that they want to play without paying too much money. And so you have like this horrible thing where you're keeping people out of the game that can't afford to get into it. And so I'm always in favor of that. And we do get reprints. We have entire reprint sets, but they really do seem to be engineered to, for the most part, not disrupt the secondary market, which there's a certain logic to that. I mean, I also want cards to be worth something. I don't want all my cards worth 10 cents. I like that my cards have value, but I dislike...
Yeah, people do want their investments to feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all for that. But like, for example, and we haven't talked about things like if Yu-Gi-Oh has the equivalent of mana as the resource for casting spells, we have mana that comes from lands, but you can't do anything in Magic without mana. You can't do anything in Magic without lands, and in the older formats in particular, you need to have the best lands to be able to keep up when it's like a turn 3, turn 4 format, and those lands are currently like $60, $80, and $100 each, some of them. And so and you need more than one. You need a play set, which would be 4, and then you need a play set of another one, and 3 of another one, and 1 of another one, and it starts getting to be like a modern deck might be $1,200 or $800, and 80% of that cost is just the lands. And so I advocate reprinting those lands, and they really don't want to do that. They really like the idea that those lands are worth a lot of money.
Exclusivity.
Yeah, they really like that.
Same in Yu-Gi-Oh. There are cards that, I think, so with Yu-Gi-Oh that exists, there are some cards that are like necessary in the competitive sphere, but then like Okay, I'm trying to think of a really good example. So that card Lightning Storm that I mentioned, you don't absolutely have to have that to enjoy playing with your friends. But on the other hand, there are certain staple cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That do fall more into that category, where it's like, okay, I would want to have... Yu-Gi-Oh! Players will recognize the card Pot of Extravagance. It's sort of one of these retrains of an old banned card called Pot of Greed. Anyway, this is a card that in a lot of competitive decks can be pretty useful, but also a lot of casual and older strategies in particular can make really good use of this card. The problem is that it's an expensive card. And so I fall in that camp where I think competitive players, if they're going to try to aim for the top and play in the regional and national level, and they're willing to commit the money and time and travel and all that to get the cards, then in many cases they don't actually mind the card's prices being high. No one loves it, but they will get the cards.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, if people want to be able to just enjoy the game locally, I think that cards should be a little more accessible. If it's a staple that a lot of older or just more casual strategies can use, I think that said card needs to be... They need to prioritize reprinting that rather quickly.
Yeah.
Or, don't print it at a super exclusive rarity early on, because it can just make kind of casual and budget player experience feel prohibitive. And, does Magic have, would you say Magic has that dynamic where just playing, I just want to pick up and play something with my friends?
That's the biggest
problem. Are there
problem.
restrictive cards?
Yeah, well, the issue is that I think most players want to just be able to play with quote unquote cards I own, and oftentimes the saying is that the most played form of Magic is formatless, kitchen table Magic. It's just people at home, they've got a box of cards, they don't read net decks, they just want to pull out their cards and put something together and play with a friend. But there's also a bit of a fantasy to that scenario, which is that the internet does exist, and people have access to it. And in addition to that, the imbalances of just a box full of random cards is very great. And so a lot of people do feel, it quickly rears its head. The Commander format used to just be, because it was really just about getting some casual games in between rounds at a GP event. And so it was really just, oh, cool, I've got these old cards, I'm going to put them together in this Commander deck, and it's not about competing to win. We're just going to sit around in a circle and do some goofy stuff. But even Commander now has turned into, and it's a hotly debated issue, there's even a competitive subset of Commander players that intentionally play highly competitive Commander and enjoy it and have a lot of fun with that, and that's valid. And Magic players are drawn to that too. It's actually growing more and more because people want to win and people like optimizing decks. And so there's a big argument right now about, whether you should be trying to make the best deck ever in all formats, whether you do that even with kitchen table Magic. At the end of the day, you just want to play, but how do you accomplish that? How do you accomplish the goal of, I just want to sit down and get a game with my friends?
That's something that I think Yu-Gi-Oh! is a relevant point, I think, to make here. So Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a very similar mentality. There are a lot of people who want to just be able to pick up their old cards and just kind of goof around with their friends. But like you said, the internet does exist. And just in any group of friends, at least one person is going to want to take it a little further. And I don't think that's bad. I mean, if it's 2020, if you just are passively interested in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or whatever, and you kind of look up some stuff on the internet, you're going to find, these strategies are a little better than these strategies. Yeah. Here's kind of some good deck building advice. And over time, it will transform into this something more complicated where, you are trying to build in a more optimal way, play in a more optimal way. With Yu-Gi-Oh! Though, at least compared to Magic, there's not much of a choice that players get. If I want to screw around with some old cards with my friends, I can do that in the confines of, my house. But the moment I go to a card shop, the competitive metagame will take effect. Yes. I mean, because there are people who are there to win, there are people who are there to have fun, there are people who are kind of in the middle to some degree. And with Yu-Gi-Oh! Though, there aren't any alternative formats. Yu-Gi-Oh has a few old alternative formats that have long since kind of just been discontinued or whatever. Like there's a sealed thing, Konami doesn't support it. There is a traditional format, Konami doesn't support it. There's even a tag format, which is like how 4 people can play. It's just 2v2. Konami doesn't really support it.
That's so weird to me because you would think that it would be in their best interest. Like, you know, that we say, like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't put and so it's like it's healthy. Like we say in Magic, you get sick of standard. So standard will be bad often. It'll be bad, and what happens? Well, you go play another format, and that way you don't quit Magic. So people say, I get sick of standard. I'll go draft.
No such thing in
and
Yu-Gi-Oh.
That's crazy because you would think Konami would, at the very least, you would think Konami would try and do a standard like system or something.
So I guess to sort of add a little bit of context to it, though, traditional format was the format where all banned cards are allowed at 1. So if you liked, playing your old banned stuff, you could play it. It's allowed at 1. Way back in the day, this was kind of a supported thing. It just sort of fizzled out. I don't know if it was lack of popularity or just something like that. So that's not a thing anymore. Like I said, there is tag. It hasn't really gotten a rules update. It got one recently on the side, but like to very little fanfare because it had been dead for so long that no one even really thinks about it. And some of the new rules of Yu-Gi-Oh don't translate as well to it. That's a different thing. And there are players who have made sort of custom formats. A really popular one is something called GOAT format, which is actually just a specific sort of snapshot in time of Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, I think the April 2005 format, set of cards and like kind of a metagame, and people like to play that. But it's unofficial. If you can get enough people in your community together, it's something that you can do, or you can of course play it online. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't really have that, so there's no recourse for the player who is maybe alienated or disillusioned by the very fast pace and very high power levels of Yu-Gi-Oh! In recent years. There's nothing that you can really go to and still be involved at your local card shop. You can maybe find a bunch of old friends who have a very similar mindset to you and then like play at home, but that's difficult. And then that kind of means that when you go to locals, you don't get to play in tournaments, and that feels like you don't get to be involved, but there isn't anything.
Right, which is why you want that support from. We have that same issue here too, like where we want Wizards support for tournaments and stuff.
Not to transition topics too much, but I actually wanted to ask, what is overall the relationship between Wizards and the players?
I wanted to ask you that too about Konami.
Because I know with Konami there's a lot to say, but I do want to hear, do people... Overall, would you say like people like Wizards? What's the relationship like? I think this is going to be good.
I mean, do you guys in the Yu-Gi-Oh world use that GIF of the dumpster fire? Do you use that to describe Konami? That's how that's probably, we literally have a card. They made a card in Magic called Garbage Fire, and that card. It was when they came out with a card called Garbage Fire. That card was what everybody referred to. Just Wizards of the Coast as a company. I would say the average person views Wizards of the Coast as well-intentioned. I think that people feel Wizards has their heart in the right place. And lately there have been some topics and issues of controversy that maybe have changed that opinion, but throughout the large history of the game, I would say that overwhelmingly, your average Magic player would feel that Wizards has its heart in the right place, but that they don't know what the heck they're doing. That they're kind of like they're just so prone to incompetence or disaster or blunder or just goofery or something that it's kind of this. We respect their heart and we disrespect their brain. Or often the saying is the one thing they can do right is make the cards. And then beyond that, it's a disaster. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to operate. They're just this big disaster of a circus. And they just happen to have 25 to 50 people in R&D or the current equivalent that know how to make cards, and the rest is this sinking ship piloted by someone with a tiny bucket trying to bail water out and headed towards an iceberg, and they just disaster, lot PR disaster prone like you wouldn't believe. PR disaster prone.
Okay, so what would you say is just over the years is the number one complaint? And then I also want to ask about that on that PR front. But first, what's the biggest complaint? Just the most common, like I kind of asked the average Magic player, what's the big issue with Wizards?
The big issue that most Magic players would say with Wizards would be one of two things. They would either say it's them being able to maintain a good standard environment. So they've got 2 years worth of sets that need to be designed to interact properly with each other for the best standard environment. And the biggest thing is people will say, they messed everything up with this one stupid card, or by not banning this one stupid card, or by banning this card, or by going this route, or by designing this mechanic, or something or another that is keeping standard from working well. I would say that's probably the most consistent, overwhelming complaint, tied with affordability, tied with cost of playing the game, would be the other one. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Okay, so for Konami, it's similar. I mean, I think in almost any game I've ever played, any kind of online community, people. I'll always say the biggest critics of a game are its fans, for better or worse. You know, like people, like if you play League of Legends or something, then the same people who play it are the ones that hate Riot Games the most, or whatever. And that it's very much the same with Yu-Gi-Oh! I think a lot of people, they feel like Konami's game balance kind of tends to be the big one. Like, power creep in recent years. Why did you release this card that, you knew would enable all these crazy combos and degenerate things? And then also price is a very big one. People just feel like, these cards are just too expensive. You're short printing them. There's there've been so many instances where, the short printing thing comes up. And, I don't know if cards are short printed, but, what will end up happening is a new set comes out, it's supposed to have 8 secret rares or something, but clearly one secret rare is much less common than the rest, and lo and behold, it's the secret rare everyone needs. There's been times where that's happened, and this is kind of getting onto the PR front of what I was alluding to. Konami doesn't communicate very much at all with the community.
Okay.
And I mean, I don't know how much Wizards does, but I can, no matter how little...
Like crazy. Wizards makes its employees that are visible. They're not all visible. Some choose to not be, I think the technical term is public facing, but they want you to be able to put a face to the company, and there are superstars. They're like literally they get columns, they get on video, they get put on cards, on advertisements and packs sometimes.
Yu-Gi-Oh is 100% the opposite. It is very, Konami is so tight-lipped, and so there's lots of kind of reasons for why this is. And I'm not even saying that, it's all a bad thing, but just the situation as it is basically Konami there's no community manager. There's no sort of avenue of sort of feedback. There's nowhere, if I had a complaint with the game, there's not really anywhere that I could direct it. I could shout it into the void.
Yeah.
I can get on Twitter and scream. I can make a YouTube video. But I mean, there's no sort of
we
official
know
channel.
Whose job it is.
Yeah.
We know whose job everything is. We know who does PR. We know who answers your emails. We know what food they like.
That is baffling.
Seriously.
That is
yeah, we know. And so when we get angry about something, we tend to think we know who is to blame. Now we're wrong, because there's maybe I'm just giving an average number. There's 50 Wizards employees that are public facing and 500 who are not, and they work on teams, but we know what the teams are, and we learn who's in charge of the team. And so we will say, this is whose fault Companions is, or this is whose fault this advertisement is, where we'll have a stupid advertisement and that is inadvertently, like sending the wrong message, and we know who approved it, sort of thing, or at least we suspect strongly, and we know them. They're there on Twitter, and they will talk to you. They will answer your question. They will post what they had for lunch that day. They will talk. You can ask them what deck they're playing. They all play Magic like crazy, and they'll talk about what their favorite cards are. We know who's in charge of the different, like, the digital game and things like, or parts of the digital game.
Konami could not be any different. That is a night and day. Now, all right, I will give them credit where it's due. I have, been fortunate enough to meet with, Konami employees on a number of occasions. The people involved at Konami are very good people. I do think they're very passionate about Yu-Gi-Oh! They're very normal people. They're not, like some people in trench coats or anything. Like, it's the people. Right. I always get the impression that they've loved Yu-Gi-Oh! For years. They want what's best. Sure. They're aware. They watch. They do read and watch things on like social media and like the internet and stuff. But I think that the corporate structure that Konami has, maybe just the Japanese roots, I think that companies are run a lot differently. It seems there's much more red tape. There's much more things. Yeah. It's very top down. Everything has to get kind of slowly approved, and so changes come extremely slowly, if at all. Social media is not like a super big priority for them. I don't know if you've seen sort of the official Yu-Gi-Oh! Twitter or Facebook pages. It is extremely rigid, extremely robotic, like very just like, today this new set releases, buy it in stores now. Like, and that's kind of what you get. There's not really a sense of humanity there. There's no jokes. There's no like back and forth.
Oh no, it's
nothing at all.
The opposite with Wizards, and this is what causes trouble at Wizards, because Wizards wants you to think of them as your friend. And they do all that stuff. So, like, you go to an event and you can sit down with the people who design the cards that you play. You can go up to them and say, "Oh, hey, it's Mark Rosewater, Melissa DeTora, Adam Prozik, like any Matt Tabak, all of these people that their role. He's the rules manager. She's on play design." And then you go, "Do you want to get a game?" And they're there for that, and they'll play with you. They'll talk to you on Twitter. They write article after article telling you how they design sets. Article after article. Talking about we had a late night and we were doing this like crazy.
Wait. You're telling me they like they publicly like say like kind of what went into designing these cards and sets. They
down to what type of bagel they had while they were doing it, like every detail.
Mind.
The only thing secretive at Wizards of the Coast is pretty much the fact that they do pay attention to the secondary market, because they are told that they will get their butts sued if they acknowledge the secondary market or something like that. But other than that, they are an open book about that stuff.
That is so open.
Like I'm sure there's things they don't talk about, but like they're almost they're so open. They write article after article about how did this card get to be. They show you the design process. This is the first iteration of the card. Then we added this to the card. Then we changed the card, and then we were testing. They show you the process. They show you the decks. So they have a team of people who play with the cards while they're in development to see if they need to be changed and stuff, and they will sometimes publish, sometimes, not always, but they will sometimes show you what those decks looked like, and they were like, this was a deck that Play Design was doing, and it's called Future League, and all kinds, and it changes and such, but they show that process.
My mind is actually blown wide open by this. I don't know how many, I just can't reiterate it enough. It is nothing like that in Yu-Gi-Oh! There is...
Wow, that's crazy.
Just things... Yeah. I think that's what leads to some of the tensions between players and Konami. Like, obviously, people are going to hate, like, oh, you didn't balance this right. Oh, this is too expensive.
Right.
I think, by and large, that wall of silence is what creates it's what makes it worse. So, as I've been...
Silence doesn't seem like a good strategy. I'm not saying be as open as Magic, but silence seems like a bad tact to take these days.
So, like, just with the examples I've said, right? Like, the ban list can come out of nowhere, right? And you don't know what to expect on it. If a ban list just kind of drops, and certain strats get hit, and some don't, and there's no explanation as to why. Like, it's just the ban list released. Oh, and remember, as I mentioned before, you don't even know the date it's coming out. You get a rough idea.
Yeah.
It could be that day, could be later, whatever. And so this ban list sort of shows up. It might be a couple weeks late. You don't know what day it's going to come out. Like ban lists have been revealed on like Wednesday evening at 12:53 p.m. You know what I mean? Like it just out of nowhere. And so the ban list shows up and something got hit and it didn't, and you get no indication of like how much it, like what went into the decisions or whatever. It just, we never kind of know any of that. And it makes me feel bad for the employees themselves, because I do think that many of them, do a great job, but they're just maybe not allowed to sort of say, and put themselves out there. And in recent years, to Konami's credit, they have started working with content creators. I've been fortunate to be like one of those content creators they've worked with. There's a few others. And my experiences with Konami themselves have been nothing short of brilliant. Very nice people, very dedicated people, very open to like listening and talking and stuff. It's just that I think this game, Yu-Gi-Oh, just needs that community interaction that it sounds like Magic kind of has in by the droves. I mean, it's...
But this causes a lot of problems because when we get angry at individuals.
Oh,
and we've had
that must
issues.
be bad. That must be bad.
We've had issues where and I think for the most part, the community tries, like, I think the community is aware not to do this, but we'll be on the subreddit and there might be a post saying something like I think there was a post that was like, should Mark Rosewater be fired because companions were such a disaster?
Oh, God,
and then people will debate. They'll be like, was that really Mark? Was he the one in charge of it? We want to figure it out. Like, what's his role? What did he do? Where did he write this article? Was he specifically the guy who thought up companions, or did he just give it the green light? And then someone will say, if he gave it the green light, he should be fired for giving it the green light. And that's crazy to go after a person on that personal level. I had someone from PR on, and people were calling for this gentleman's head over a very, I think, stupid decision and wrong decision that I got to announce on my channel because of him. But he was the face, and people know him. They know his life. They know his name, and he is the guy in charge of he's like the press secretary. And people were so angry about a choice that he didn't make, but he had to announce that they were like this guy needs to go, but they're not just saying this guy needs to go, they're saying his name, and they're tagging him on the things, and
I do see your
it goes
point there,
crazy, and then there's a death threat.
And I think with Yu-Gi-Oh, that's
Magic players,
that's definitely a thing. Like Yu-Gi-Oh's kind of got that same. It can get very hive-mindy, very witch hunt. People. At least, I guess that is a defense that Konami has had that makes a lot of sense, because people's names typically aren't really put out there. People know of a few employees that, but they don't know much about them. They don't know, like, exactly what they're doing and exactly what's going on. I do think that is a nice protection for the employees to have. My main thing is I've always sort of wanted the social media front, even if they're not, like, putting people's, like, names and faces and stuff to the game. It would be nice if just the social outlets still interacted a bit more. Just like the official Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG Twitter or whatever. Just had a bit more of a sense of humor.
Having a community team seems important.
Something like that. Because, I mean, it sounds to me like, at least in Magic, even if things can get pretty intense, it still seems like people are probably happier knowing than not knowing. I don't know, though. I mean, like, there's a running joke in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community where, like, people sort of say, like, Yu-Gi-Oh! Communities are like, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Players are just willing to take anything. Like, it's like, we're all BDSM slaves, Konami, they're just that type of thing.
We say Magic players will get outraged over anything. I don't agree with that personally, especially as a critic. I take a little bit of offense to every time that I have a complaint that people are like, you just complain about everything. But there are days where it feels like Wizards could say the sky is blue, and people will say, what do you mean by that? Outrage, fire them. Like we really get angry, and we really get ferocious. But I've thought that some of that is that I wanted to make a video that we might be too public with how things work at Wizards, that people take it personally. They think that this corporation is your friend.
Yeah,
because you know the people who work at it.
Big thing.
And the people are great. The same thing, and I've heard even the angriest Magic players say all the individuals who work at Wizards are good people, are nice people, but that company, something about the corporate hive mind, like alluded to a second ago, it just the way they do things just seems to lead to all of these decisions that are very questionable.
That is very much the same thing in Yu-Gi-Oh too, where I guess we're in a probably similar position. I'm assuming you've probably worked with Wizards to, on some things, in some capacity.
Not as much as you might think, but they do. So Wizards has
they reached out. What is that like?
A spectrum. Yeah, they've reached out. I've done, like I said, I got to announce a disastrous product on my channel, which was rather revolutionary. They were like, "We want to announce this thing on your channel," and I was like, "That's cool. What is it?" And I went, "Uh-oh," but we did it anyway, and that was a first, because usually what they do is they have people that are full on hired by them and paid by them. I've never been paid a penny by Wizards for anything, and hired by them and paid by them, and that's who they do the biggest stuff with, because those are people who sign contracts. I've never signed a contract with them, and that you can feel pretty safe with. But what they do is every new set, they give out cards to a wide swath of people to preview. So the first place you're going to see a new card for a new set will be like on someone's Twitter feed or on someone's YouTube channel or on someone's stream. And this is a way that they build up hype. So you're just watching your favorite Magic streamer. They might not work for Wizards. They might not ever have been paid by Wizards. And they go, "All right, guys, I got a card from the set that's coming out in a month to show you here for the first time ever." And that's wild. And I'm surprised Konami doesn't do a similar thing.
Well, Konami, they very, very recently, as of just maybe the latter end of last year, they have started letting content creators in on getting to reveal a product at an embargo date and everything like that. And that's been really nice. I've gotten to do that a few times, and the players really enjoy it. So recently Konami has done they've been a little bit more forward thinking in that regard. I think it puts me at a bit of an impasse, and you've probably felt this way too, I would think, where because I've gotten to interact with Konami some, but I also am a content creator. I read so many comments every day just on new videos and old videos and on social media where people are just voicing complaints, but also people are voicing counter complaints, or people are defending,
Right.
I guess I see so many perspectives and hear so many takes on everything. I almost feel like I don't even know where to stand at times. Because Konami, they're not evil people. No, you know what I mean. You ask the wrong Yu-Gi-Oh player the wrong day, and people, burn them to the ground, right?
Same thing in Magic. Exact same thing in Magic.
Building and we're just gonna light it on fire. It's they're ruining the game. Konami hates the players.
Yeah.
They're killing everything. Why this is so idiotic? Anyone could do a better job. But it's there are valid complaints about Konami, but then sometimes they get taken out of hand. But then I've met Konami employees, all very nice people. I don't think that there's anyone in Konami who's actually evil. No matter where you look, I don't think that individually anyone's got it out for. It's not like that. But it's just when I hear all of these different things, I have to be a content creator and read comments, and also sometimes if I get to work with a company behind the scenes, I get to see their perspective where it's okay, well, it's not that we released this product this way to hurt anyone or to ruin someone's day or slash something up and burn. It's just this is the context and this is the thing surrounding it, and we can't reveal all of that to the player side. But if both sides could know a little more about where the other's coming from, there could be just some middle ground. I think players might come to understand, that actually does make sense that they do that, or I guess they actually have been looking out for us,
right,
the whole time.
Right.
But it's so difficult when there's no communication and no acknowledgement there. It's just then you're just going on trust, and then players kind of start to fill in the blanks with their own narrative of they did this to sell this product. That's the real reason they hit this card. They're just trying to sell this thing,
Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I have a final thing that I want to ask you, which is in Magic, we have a lot of people who came to us from Yu-Gi-Oh! Like crazy. Like I would bet money that of my audience who are tuning in, hopefully some of your audience is tuning in today too, but of my audience tuning in today, I would bet maybe even half of them played Yu-Gi-Oh! At least once at some point, if not played it regularly, and know how to play it vaguely, played it at some point. I really feel that people have played Yu-Gi-Oh! That currently play Magic. Do you feel like when you're at are there Magic players that are at Yu-Gi-Oh! Things? Do you find people who left Magic for Yu-Gi-Oh! or used to play Magic but now play Yu-Gi-Oh! Or I'm very curious what that's like on the other side of the aisle, as it were.
It's interesting that you mention it. I think that with Yu-Gi-Oh! It sounds like it's largely kind of what you're saying here, where people maybe will play Yu-Gi-Oh! And then transition a bit to Magic more so, or I don't know. I feel like I've met all kinds. Like it's very. I've met people who like they used to play Magic and now they play Yu-Gi-Oh. There are people who play Yu-Gi-Oh and just end up quitting for Magic. I think based on what I've just heard from you just today, it sort of seems to me like the games are almost like old Magic was really powerful and new Magic's a lot more like nuanced and kind of more finely controlled, whereas like new Yu-Gi-Oh's got the power creep. I really do wonder about that. Like I wish I could do like a poll and just find out like what is the sort of like where does it cross over, like and what are people's reasons for crossing over. I know a lot of people find Magic's sort of slower pace, at least compared to Yu-Gi-Oh, to be like a really good thing, and it feels more relaxing. But then some people feel like Magic is they want that like kind of fast-paced, high-octane Yu-Gi-Oh where like I'm comboing and comboing and comboing and
right. Magic is I counter your spell. I'm going to draw 3 cards, look at them, and choose one to keep and put 2 more in the bottom, and let's slow things down. Magic tends we consider that type of play to be the most optimal or cerebral, highest level blue Magic, play. I don't say I agree with that. That's kind of the impression in the community, is that you've reached optimal Magic when you're being a control player.
Yeah, it seems like it's like a marathon versus a sprint, I would say. Like
interesting.
Yu-Gi-Oh,
I can see that.
People want to win. They want to win fast. They want to, I gotta win quick. Gotta like not let my opponent do anything. Like, for better or worse, there's still a lot of depth. There's still a lot of nuance. But I do think that seems like the biggest thing. And if I had to say like the one thing that I took away the most from this is I'm just so shocked that Magic is as open, like Wizards of the Coast is as open and forthcoming. And I'm also just so shocked to hear that like you guys came from a point of like very ridiculous power levels and have now come down in it's just the opposite of a lot of what we have. So
the oldest Magic cards are the most powerful in that sense. They have a lot to do with breaking the rules of resources in terms of just giving you far too much mana far too quickly or drawing too many cards too easily, sort of thing. Or in the case of the lands, the original dual lands just being too good. And I think it's something that even R&D and Mark Rosewater has written about, where it's like the cards were just too good, and it has to be kept below that point when we make new lands every set, new counter spells every set, new card draws every set, but they can never be as good as those first batch of broken ones from the early years. But we even have that too. I mean, anybody who played an original Innistrad knows half the cards in that set they could never reprint in Standard because they're just too good. And it just turns into that with a lot of sets, that we can never go back to having these cards in Standard again because they're just too good. From 8 years ago, then 5 years ago, 10 years ago. No.
That's
yeah.
Wow. I feel like I've really learned a lot though. Like as somebody who is very, very, very lightly dabbled in Magic before, and so many years ago, it's just tackling it now from this perspective. It's so interesting to me. Like, the communities are like, it feels like at their core are quite similar. It just kind of seems like
yes.
expresses itself differently in both games, but like it's ultimately the same sort of people wanting the same thing out of their game.
Thank you for coming out today.
Thank you.
Paul. This was a fantastic conversation. I want to ask that anybody who is a member of the Team APS audience that is watching this and still at this point in the video, I'm really curious if you've played Magic. If there's anyone coming over from Team APS that is like, oh yeah, I used to play Magic and then went from Magic to Yu-Gi-Oh, make that comment so that I can see it. I'm curious of, because I know for a fact of my viewers, half of them played Yu-Gi-Oh. I want to know if the Team APS viewers, if any of them used to play Magic and now play Yu-Gi-Oh. That's what really makes me curious.
I feel like we'll be pleasantly surprised, honestly, by how many. Okay. I think that's going to be a lot, actually, now that I think about it. Who knows? And for my viewers that used to play Yu-Gi-Oh or still play Yu-Gi-Oh, I cannot recommend the Team APS YouTube channel enough. I already direct most people over there with questions about Yu-Gi-Oh sized accessories from card sleeves and deck boxes, but I would really recommend go checking them out. And if nothing else, boy, when they do a funny skit, that's always a pleasure. And it's speaking the same language. Like I said, I can follow along just fine with those skits. But if you do play Yu-Gi-Oh, or you used to play Yu-Gi-Oh, or you know a friend who plays Yu-Gi-Oh, go on over and check out Team APS. They do some great content over there. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you again for having me on. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully it provided some, new, unique perspective, or it might have just been things you already know. It's just fun to kind of hear it compared and contrasted like this. How much does a Pot of Greed cost? Pot of Greed is the classic, most broken Yu-Gi-Oh card, right? Yeah. Pot of Greed, is that the one? That's the one. How much is that going to cost? If I wanted to buy a Pot of Greed, what would that cost me? There's irony in the fact that it's very cheap. It has been reprinted, just to heaven and back. But there are some very expensive varieties of Pot of Greed that are hundreds and hundreds. I can't put an exact price on it, but no, not hundreds of dollars. Look up what a Black Lotus costs, my friend. Look up what a Black Lotus costs. That's funny that you mentioned that. I did a video maybe a few months back about why people like card games. And I heard Black Lotus is is it $5,000 or am I far off the mark? So a Black Lotus might cost you somewhere in the kingdom of $40,000. Oh, Lord. So what you're saying is that the commander should take an already good card and make it better, rather than a card that is dead without the commander that will then be able to do something. Right. So there's a really good example. I play Zedru the Great-Hearted Commander. She's the donating goat lady. Right. I really enjoy it, and I get a bunch of people who will suggest cards that I should put in it that all have some big drawback, and the idea is that you'll give it away to somebody. Right. One of the ones that comes up a lot is Aggressive Mining, which is a card where you can't play lands and you can sack lands to draw cards, is the basics of what it does. Which sounds great because you can make it so someone never plays a land again. Cool stuff, right? Except if, say, I go to cast Aggressive Mining and they kill my Zedru, I'm now locked out of ever creating enough lands to pay the commander tax to cast my Zedru, and I'm stuck with this card forever and am basically dead in the water.